Hello to everyone in the Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Cathedral community and all of our friends. This is Father Jonathan. I wanted to continue our reflection on the sixth Beatitude, Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, by discussing a really important aspect of the Orthodox understanding of spiritual life, noting that in many of the church fathers and mothers, when they talk about spiritual life, they talk about it with three distinct stages. Not progressive stages where you kind of move through and accomplish one and move to the next, but concentric circles of interweaving ways of being. And the first one, that is the one where most of us find ourselves, is praxis or purification, practical philosophy in St. Maximus's language. But it's the things that we do to purify our hearts. We purify our hearts, and as we do so, we're cultivating virtue. We're acquiring virtue, which we've already talked about elsewhere is the embodiment of theosis, but we'll get to that in a moment. And so we do certain things to cultivate purity of heart, to cultivate the virtues, to acquire these virtues, these ways of being in the world that are manifesting God's presence through our unity with Him. And we're coming to terms with and casting out those things that are preventing us from authentically communing with our God, those things that are making us have impure hearts, not authentic hearts that are oriented totally towards God. And these include fasting and prayer and reading the scriptures and going to the service, of course, but we also know that they include other things, the practice of mercy and love and peacemaking, things that we'll talk about in our discussion of any number of the Beatitudes. And so how we treat our neighbor is intimately connected with how we understand purity of heart in relationship to God. Because as we cultivate purity of heart and acquire the virtues, well, we begin to orient ourselves in a certain way in the midst of the world towards other people and towards creation itself. And so this first stage of purification peels away those things that are preventing us from authentically engaging with God first and foremost and our neighbor, and opens us up to the next stage of spiritual life, which is theoria, or contemplation. Now, there's a little nuance to this, and there's a few ways of understanding it. A way that's been helpful for me is theoria is not just vision of God or seeing God. It's also seeing how God is actively engaged in the world, how God is present in everything. We can see the hidden reasons for everything's being, and seeing how all things are connected to God. We become aware through contemplative awareness of God's presence. We see God in the world. But that's not the end of the story, because it's not enough to see, because what we're seeking is communion or union with God, which is the final stage. And again, it's not a stage that we get to once and for all, but it's an ever deepening stage, just like any of these stages. We ever deepen in our purity of heart and our acquisition of the virtue and become exponentially more virtuous. We can never exhaust our vision of God through contemplation. And finally, even when we reach the pinnacle of the stages, mystical theology, as Maximus puts it, or deification, or theosis, or union with God, or divine human communion, we still ever, in an ever deepening way, cultivate our connection, our union with God, because God is inexhaustible. We cannot exhaust the mystery of who God is. And so purity of heart is kind of like a first stage of this, but it's not something that we have to acquire once and let go of. It's something we have to live every day. And each of these different things, each of these stages of spiritual life, don't just have to do with our relationship with God, but our relationship with one another, our relationship with those around us and the world. I've already talked about praxis and how purity of heart and cultivation of the virtues orients us towards other people and how we interact with them and interact with the world. And by seeing in our contemplative awareness how God is actively engaged in the world, we begin to not only see what God sees, and see God in everything, but we begin to love like God loves and who God loves. And so we understand and see everything in creation as a manifestation of God, and therefore we love it because God loves it. We participate in God's very being in the final stage by being in communion with Him. We participate in Him by grace. We participate in God's by grace. We are deified, not because of anything inherent in our own nature, not that we ourselves are by nature divine, but because we participate in God by grace. We become everything He is by grace and not by nature, which is beautiful. We become partakers of the divine nature. And in doing so, we act in the midst of the world as members of Him. And therefore, with purity of heart, with contemplative awareness, theoria, and having moved into the ever-deepening process of theosis, we begin to act in the world as God acts. And so we've already seen how this process is in itself a fulfillment of this commandment. If purity of heart is the end of the first stage, purity of heart, acquisition of the virtues, love, mercy, all of these things, and when one is those things, they begin to see God. We see contemplative awareness come into play. So part of divine vision, seeing God, is the second stage of spiritual life. And the final stage, theosis or mystical theology or deification, theosis, is just coming to the totality of these things. And then from there we move back to the earlier stages. We become more in union with God, and so we become more like God in our purity of heart, in our expression of the virtues, in our contemplative awareness of His presence in the midst of the world. They're all interconnected. And so this is a very deep conversation, but this is the depth of our faith. And it's not something that we do in one sphere of our life, as we've already talked about. No, it's something that touches all aspects of our life. We're supposed to cultivate the virtues in the location where we find ourselves. We're not called to be monks. We're not called to be nuns. We're not all called to be priests. We're called to be whoever we're called to be. Some of us are called to be parents and some of us aren't. Some of us are called to be teachers and lawyers and physicians and restaurateurs and any number of other professions. We're called to actualize the call to love God and our neighbor, the cultivation of the virtues, the seeking of contemplative awareness, and ultimately union with God where we are. And therefore we have a set number of people that we will interact with. And we're called to manifest God's presence to those people wherever we are. And that's the beauty of our faith. We don't compartmentalize. We don't compartmentalize as we pass through these stages, thinking there's only one way to live our spiritual life. So be where you are. Cultivate virtue. Seek out divine vision and orient yourself towards divine human communion so that by the grace of God we may be one as He is one with His Father by grace. And we may be as one to one another and the rest of creation as He intends. And in this way, the kingdom of heaven, salvation, will be manifest. God bless you. We're here for you. Don't hesitate to reach out. Call us, email us, send us a message on social media. Leave a note in the comment section, whatever you want. Have a beautiful rest of your day.